Hello, I'm Drew J, and you're watching CUTV here in Montreal. And our guest today is a journalist who has been covering and analyzing Canada's media in general, and Montreal's media in particular, for decades. Steve Faguy has written for the Montreal Gazette, CBC Radio, and Cart.ca, among others. His personal blog, which I'll pronounce fogstein.ca to prevent misunderstandings, has been regularly updated since 2007. I will say that it's rare to have someone follow a beat for such a long time with as much critical insight as Steve has brought. So comprehensive is Steve's vision that not even CUTV has escaped its scrutiny. We are, in any case, grateful for the opportunity to ask a few questions. Thanks so much for joining us, Steve Faguy.
You're very welcome.
Great. So let's. I want to start, I guess, with the sort of some of the big picture items of the Canadian media landscape. The past several years have really seen kind of an apocalyptic scene unfold. You have thousands of job cuts, hundreds of publications shuttered across Canada. I guess just from your vantage point, sort of, you've been watching this quite closely. How would you characterize the current landscape? Is it kind of the terror dome that headlines suggest, or is there some kind of nuance that might be worth?
I don't know if I'd use the word terror dome. That seems a bit dramatic. But it is bad.
Yeah,
we're seeing a sort of a bottoming out of the particularly the advertising market, both in print and in broadcast and digital media. And so, all these news outlets that relied on this as a major source of their income for decades, even close to a century, suddenly find that it's evaporating at 10-20% a year. And so, the result is they have to cut costs in order to maintain a healthy balance sheet. And so we're seeing a lot of layoffs, not just in the tens and hundreds, but even thousands. So yeah, it is definitely on this downward slope, and has been for most of the past 20 years, where we see a lot fewer, particularly in those sort of what they call legacy media publications, those TV stations, radio stations, print newspapers, magazines, that just don't have the kind of money that they used to, and so can't afford the kind of staff that they used to have.
Yeah, so you would say that it's mainly the loss of advertising revenue that's the sort of key piece there.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the big thing. If you think about it, in up until the 1990s, newspapers were swimming in money because in order to sell a car or find a renter, you needed to put in a classified ad. Television stations, radio stations, they had almost these captive markets. Everyone, in the evening would be watching, one of maybe 3 or 4 TV stations. Everyone going to work in the morning would listen to one of 3 or 4 radio stations. And so, advertisers knew that to reach those people, you had to go through those mediums. Now you can go on social media, you can target your ads better. Instead of getting everyone in a geographic area, you get just, expectant mothers or recent retirees or whatever. So yeah, I think that has been the main driver. A lot of people want to pretend like it's a question of confidence, it's a question of corporate greed or whatever, and those things are not immaterial. But if you look at just the raw numbers, definitely advertising is the biggest driver of all this.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, how do you see the sort of ownership structure, specifically sort of for-profit corporations, playing into the current crisis? You said it's not immaterial. So yeah, just could you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, so, we've seen a lot of consolidation. I work for the Montreal Gazette, which is part of the Post Media, which is the largest chain of major newspapers in Canada. Television stations have been gobbled up into this sort of oligopoly, which was then purchased by these telecom giants because they had a lot of money. And so you have a lot of that, but you also have a lot of independent media or smaller media that are also sort of facing um, the same crisis, but maybe dealing with it a bit differently. Um, so it's not just a corporate media thing, but it it just kind of feels different when you're working for a small independent publication that isn't as concerned with making money or increasing shareholder dividends versus working for a large company where the main driver being brought in by the executives who are being pushed by the board of directors, who are being pushed by shareholders, is profit, is making money. Um, so yeah, there are definitely a lot of criticisms as far as how corporate media has sort of tried to streamline things, take a bit of the soul out of local media in order to make things as cheap as possible for them to produce. Um, but it's not just a corporate media thing. We're seeing this, all sorts of different media outlets of all different sizes are having these kinds of problems.
I mean, it certainly seems like it's the advertising driven business model that's the sort of key piece here. Do you see do you see an alternative path extending back into the past? Like, was there a different way to do things rather, other than making journalism dependent on these, like, as you said, gigantic ad revenues that were happening in the 80s? But then obviously,
There are definitely other
you live by the
models.
ad, you die by the ad.
Yeah, there are definitely other models out there. A lot of it was a hybrid model where you had subscription revenue, but definitely advertising. For most mainstream media, I would say advertising was definitely the big draw, uh, you know, revenue driver. Um, there are other models. A lot of more specialty publications are more subscription based, but then you run into the sort of side problem that nobody wants to pay for journalism anymore, um, and so people are exploring all sorts of other creative ways of paying the bills, whether it's direct donations or government subsidies or finding ways to cut costs. Um, there isn't a there isn't a magic business model that's come up, and it's not for lack of trying. People have tried all sorts of things, but it's been 20 years that we've been facing this crisis, and no one has solved the problem yet, which makes me think that there probably isn't an easy solution to this, or a particularly elegant one. And so, yeah, a lot of media are doing all sorts of things that they can, whether it's hosting conferences where you get access to their journalists, or running crowdfunding campaigns, or partnering with people who want to do sponsored content or branded content, or whatever you want to call it. Um, Coming up with partnerships with not just commercial organizations but non-profits who need to get messages out. So there are things being tried. A lot of people are trying multiple things at the same time to sort of hedge their bets. But yeah, um, there's no magical solution. And as people try these things, some of them succeed, some of them barely succeed, some of them fail. A lot of them, they're kind of in between. Maybe they're just being kept afloat by the generosity of their owners. Um, but there's no magical solution. No real solid, okay, we've done this, therefore this is a model everyone should follow.
Cool. Yeah, I want to loop back to that in a minute, but I guess I wanted to zoom in a bit on what the impact looks like in Montreal specifically. I guess just to start, I'm curious if is there a difference between how these sort of big cuts have hit the French and English sides respectively?
It's definitely hit both sides. It's sort of the same underlying issues affecting francophone media in Quebec as it is English language media in Canada, the United States. I would say that the Quebec culture is a bit more insular because of the language divide. So you have more consumption of homegrown content, not just journalistic, but media in general. So there's a bit of help there. If you look at an organization like La Presse, for example, that they still rely on advertising revenue. Their journalism is free. They don't have any subscription revenue. They do seek donations, but it's not what makes the difference as far as profitability, or in their case, surplusability, because they're a nonprofit. So that helps a bit. But Quebecor has cut a lot of positions. The Bell cuts and other cuts have affected their French language media as much as their English language media. So, it helps a bit, but it doesn't insulate Quebec from these kinds of market forces as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I'm curious, you every time there's sort of another round of cuts, you seem to have, I think English language media in Montreal is already sort of a small village, but you seem to have, a lot of contacts and people who talk to you. How are journalists sort of feeling about these successive waves of cuts?
It's interesting you ask that, because I'm actually not that. Like, I don't have beers with a lot of journalists after hours. A lot of people are like, "Oh, this person is married to that person." I'm like, I don't know that. I would say that from the people I do talk to, that it's sort of a morale thing. When there's a round of cuts and you have that uncertainty of who's staying, who's going, how are we going to continue without these people? How are we going to continue with a product that is, going to be noticeably poorer because we don't have the same kind of staff as we used to. So there's definitely that morale, that sort of sunken morale. And regardless of medium, that'll happen. And that also comes with things like, if you're canceling internship programs, which is often the only way that a lot of these media get new blood, because they can't afford to hire a lot of new positions. That can be pretty demoralizing. In some cases, people they're like, you know what, I'm done. I'm reaching my retirement age. I'm close enough. I'm throwing in the towel. And a lot of the people who can do that have already done that. So what you're left with are the people who, for whatever reason, because they either love the job or because they can't afford to do something else, they're just hanging on. And yeah, I think it's just a morale, just a low morale thing. And
and what do you think is
cycles, right? Because you have cuts, then things are okay for a while. Maybe you have these little boosts and whatever, and then there's another round of cuts, and then kind of all starts over again.
And what do you think? I mean, you've been watching the scene for at least 17 years, maybe more, but just going by your blog. But yeah, I'm curious, flashback to 2007 and contrast to now, like what's the difference in terms of the amount of coverage that's available and the quality of coverage, specifically in English Montreal?
In English Montreal, well, you have, it depends on, if you want to get into specifics, it really depends on the medium. For example, I was at I've been at the Gazette since 2005. When I started, they had a national reporter in Ottawa. They had two provincial reporters in Quebec City. They had various beat writers, music writer, a film critic, a bunch of arts reporters, a whole business department. Now it's, with one reporter still in Quebec City, there's like a couple of arts reporters, one business reporter. So a big thing, particularly for print media, is the loss of those sort of beat covering jobs where you have one person who specializes in something. Now everyone's kind of become a sort of all-purpose general assignment reporter. In radio, it used to be the music stations would have, and talk stations would have people working overnights. They have live shows overnights. That's long been a thing of the past. There's a lot more national content on radio because it's cheaper to produce that way. For television, again, loss of a lot of journalists. You have, used to have a a cameraman reporter team. That's largely gone by the wayside now. Most part, it's reporters shooting stuff on their own cameras or even just on an iPhone, um, because it's very portable, and that saves the company a lot of money, but it results in a less sleek product. It kind of feels sometimes like it's just, we have to get this done. The visual quality isn't that important to us. Let's just put something out there. So yeah, in various media, you see when you have these cuts, the effect it has on quality, and all the various media are trying to minimize that effect.
Mm-hmm.
But there's only so much you can do. So the big stories are still going to get reported, but you're going to see gaps in how much, how comprehensive that coverage is in terms of getting every story, in terms of getting every angle in every story. Because as you cut, you have just less human resources. You have less resources at hand to do the kind of coverage that you used to be able to do when you weren't so concerned about money.
Yeah. I'm curious. I mean, this gets into speculation to a certain extent, but I'm curious if do you have a sense of like what kinds of stories might be missed, or what kinds of just a hypothetical example of like what kind of follow up might be missing, or what kind of specifically with regard to the public interest. Like, is there something? Do you have a sense of the kind of range of information or coverage that might be not available anymore?
Well, to give you an example, a lot of coverage is in politics, for example, where you have, the premier says something, an opposition party will say something to contradict the premier, and nowadays, first of all, nowadays you get something from the premier. Often, you get is a press release from the opposition party because you don't have a reporter who has enough time to like get comment from the opposition party. So you wait until their press release comes out. But a lot of it is, you might have that story where the premier says something, the opposition leader says something, and nowadays that'll be it. Whereas in the old days, you might have a specialist who would, comment on, well, what's the real story? It's something a little bit in between. Here's some analysis of what's actually going on. You might have a columnist or two who would give some analysis there. You might have a beat reporter who knows their stuff, who can sort of fact check both sides. Now we just don't have time for that kind of thing. A lot of what we're losing is not the big story of what happened, that natural disaster or that political issue of the day. It's the original reporting. It's the enterprise reporting of, here's a story that I came across, that I've researched, that I spent a week on, that is going to be something you're not going to hear from other media because they had no idea what was going on. That's the kind of thing that we're losing when we lose staff, because you have to cover those big stories of the day. You don't have enough time for those more featurey stories, those smaller stories, those stories that don't make as much of an impact, and that you have to prioritize other things, so you're deprioritizing that.
Great. Yeah, I want to get into the CRTC a little bit. And I was going to just sort of ask some sort of broader questions, but maybe I'll just make it a little more interesting by just sort of sharing CUTV's sort of official perspective, and then you can tell me, as somebody who's observing all these sort of regulatory goings on, what your perspective is. But I guess our sort of, in a nutshell, our take is that when cable TV and telecommunications infrastructure was originally created, there was sort of a public, a public interest mandate, and that went up as high as 10%. Basically, governments would say, okay, sure, lay your cables through the right of way and create all this highly lucrative infrastructure, but you have to put in 10% of your gross revenues to public interest programming. So that in the 70s and 80s led to like an explosion of community TV production across Canada. You had like as many as 300 production hubs across the country. But as those sort of regional cable operators merged and became these sort of megacorps, they also concentrated their political power, and as a result have been able to sort of whittle that down to zero, basically. So and so now, I guess in the current context, when you have when they've been able to capture the CRTC and sort of say, okay, we're not actually obligated to give any of our money or any of the gigantic amounts of money that we made through this sort of ability to create this infrastructure. Um, you know, uh, we're we're now all of a sudden going to have these gigantic cuts because it's not profitable anymore to run a local news channel, for example, or run local radio stations, or do any of the sort of coverage that they're doing under their auspices. And so you see these, yeah, like pretty apocalyptic cuts. I mean, 1,200 jobs cut by Bell just a few weeks ago, in the last few weeks. Um, and 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 this is a gigantically profitable company. So if that mandate was still there, in our view, you wouldn't have to make those cuts because they wouldn't have the option. They would just like, okay, yeah, you're making tons of money, not on journalism, but you still have to fund it. Whereas they were making money on journalism, or they were funding journalism contingent on them making money off of it. So it's not a question of profitability overall, but it's a question of, what the baseline mandate is. Yeah, so I guess just to start, I'm curious whether you have a different opinion, or what you would see that you would find fault with that sort of account of things for the last 4 decades.
So a bit of context here. So the CRTC was essentially created because you had you had this public resource, which is the airwaves, the electromagnetic spectrum that radio and TV stations use to reach an audience. And someone had to decide who gets access to these, how is it coordinated and stuff. And one of the things that the CRTC does is that it says, in order to get access to this, you have to provide some sort of public service. You have what used to be called conditions of license. So in order for us to give you a license, you have to meet these criteria. You have to do these things. When cable TV came around, the CRTC sort of extended its regulatory powers to cable, even though cable doesn't have that limited resource. It's data over a copper wire. In the beginning, it was sort of airwaves over. It was electromagnetic signals over a copper wire. So they sort of extend themselves to that. And now most television is done digitally, even over the internet. But still, the CRTC has a bit of power. And yes, the CRTC does require that television distributors. So your Bell, your Videotron, your Rogers, those cable companies have to spend a certain amount of their revenues on Canadian content, and it's broken down. It's a bit more granularized than it used to be, but it's about 5% total, and that hasn't really changed over the past since I've started. I think the past 20, 30 years. What has changed though is that it used to be that you could take a certain amount of that money and put it toward community television. And a lot of providers chose to do that because, if they just give it to some fund or something, they have no control over it. It doesn't give them any added value. Whereas if they put it into a community channel that they then distribute, that becomes an added value for their customers. They're like, okay, if you subscribe to us, you get all this, but you also get a community channel that has some programming for you and has our branding on it. What the CRTC did about 10 years ago, I have to double check on the date, was it said, okay, local news is in a crisis, local television news, and they need more sources of funding. And they decided, well, cable companies have to take a bunch of money and give it to community television. Let's take that money and allow them to spend a certain amount on their affiliated local television stations instead. So Bell could take money that Bell 5 TV subscribers pay into their fund and use it on CTV stations. Rogers can use it on City TV. At the time, Shaw could use it on global stations. Um, and in smaller markets, you still have to have community TV stations, but in larger markets, that could be 100%. You can shut down your community TV because you have these major, for-profit local TV news stations and even CBC stations that are doing that local programming. So you don't really need community television. That royally pissed off a lot of community television uh, uh, providers, a lot of community television producers, and it kind of happened without that much warning from the CRTC. So in that case, yeah, there's been this sort of this major cut to community television programming to the benefit of local news stations. Um, and it has also created this problem because when you had Rogers buying up Shaw, Rogers decided, okay, we're going to take that money that were then Shaw television subscribers paid that went to Global. We're going to give that to our stations, which are city TV stations. And that left Global in the lurch because they lost millions of dollars a year. And they're still kind of figuring out how to make that work at the CRTC level, because the CRTC has these funds, but those funds are based on historic levels of funding, and now that's changing. So it's kind of a mess that they have to deal with now. But yeah, there's been definitely a major cut to community television. I hear a lot of people talk about regulatory capture, and there's definitely, a lot of this people at the CRTC, a lot of them have experience in telecom or broadcasting industries, which you would kind of expect because that's how you know what you're talking about. A lot of them don't, though. And I think if you talk to someone like Bell, for example, about regulatory capture, I think they would probably laugh at you a little bit because just the past week, they have been spent trying to argue with the CRTC that this hearing that they're holding over wholesale access to fiber optic cables, that they should not allow, these independent service providers, these independent ISPs, to get access to these fiber cables that they've just laid. And it seems pretty clear that the CRTC is moving in that direction, that they've kind of already made a decision. They're just kind of figuring out the details now. And these cuts that Bell made, they blamed it on the CRTC, disincentivizing their investments in their networks. And we can totally have a debate on that, but I don't think, the actions of the CRTC do not suggest, to me anyway, that there's this regulatory capture in place. If anything, the CRTC it listens quite a bit to various interest groups, whether it's the Writers Guild, independent producers, small official language minority communities and stuff like that. So I think they do try to balance as much as they can between various interests of stakeholders, sometimes to the detriment of sort of regular Joe Schmo Canadians who do not, don't have these lobbyists who can go up to them and make these, fancy presentations. I think my biggest criticism of the CRTC would be that they are they're very slow, and they tend to favor the status quo, which can be very problematic when things are changing so quickly. So, when I talk about funding formulas for local television, for example, it's all based on historic rates, what used to be the case, instead of what should be the case or what's reasonable. And that has been a problem ever since I've been covering them. They've had various commissioners, various chairpeople who've tried to get things going, tried to change things, but it is a very slow moving apparatus. And if I had one major criticism of the CRTC, it would be that it is very slow to react, and it tends to favor, when it does react, it tends to favor keeping the system in place, assuming that what is currently in place is the best option for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I can see how Bell would be upset about any little, sort of adjustment that sort of might cut into their profits. But I guess the counterpoint that I would see is just that the baseline of telecommunications regulation in Canada is that Bell makes billions in profits. I mean, all the cable companies make literally billions in profits. They have gigantic profit margins, and yet they have to be bribed by the government to like keep to improve infrastructure and extend it to places that might not be as profitable, um, and aren't really, and are clearly not carrying out the public trust that they're supposed to be, in terms of like, you don't create, I mean, 1,200 journalism jobs in Canada. That's like, I mean, if even if a chunk of those are journalism jobs, that's like a significant fraction of the overall um, journalism workforce. I mean, that's what we depend on. Just communities across the country depend on to like understand the world around them, and to not have things just running amok with like, corruption. But it's also just like civic social fabric. But that said, yeah, I mean, so they're making billions. They have to be bribed to even spend a few million here or there to like get this community or that community connected, unless it's super profitable. And then, yeah, maybe they'll complain when a smaller ISP gets to use their use their fiber or whatever. But I mean, it seems like the overwhelming tilt of the playing field is in their favor.
Um, yeah. So first of all, the number of jobs, we don't actually know how many journalism jobs Bell has cut here. We know that it's 4,800 overall across what's called Bell Canada Enterprises, which is their parent corporation. I think that one number they've said is that it's less than 10% of the overall jobs, so about maybe 500 jobs, a little less than 500 jobs, are at Bell Media specifically. And then Bell Media itself is a large organization that has specialty channels, it has Crave, it has all the radio stations and stuff. So it is, in terms of how many of those are journalistic jobs, we know there's been quite a few, and at the national level, we've lost some at the local level. We don't know how many exactly it's been. But yeah, again, like I said, I think the CRTC tries to strike a balance. It's true that telecom companies aren't very eager to serve small communities where the cost of laying down telecommunications line, whether it's fiber or cable, is more than they could recoup by charging those people. And so we have these broadband funds that are supported by the government that are sort of subsidizing this. But in terms of Bell, Bell's fiber deployment in areas like Toronto and Montreal and Ottawa, areas that already had cable companies, so they were sort of creating competition for the first time. They spent billions of dollars on this, and I don't want to underplay that, because that is a major expense on their part. I do think that their argument that we have to cut this because the CRTC isn't incentivizing us to build out new fiber. That's their choice. I'm not particularly scandalized by that. Like that is a business decision, just about everything else Bell does is a business decision. It is a business. It's a for-profit corporation. It's not like Rogers or Quebecor, where there's a controlling family. It is widely held by people like you and me. So that they're going to make decisions that make sense for their business. But yeah, whether telecommunications, particularly fiber, is a public trust, I think that's a matter of debate. There aren't too many communities that have no internet connection to the world at all. What Bell is doing, for the most part, is providing, upgraded facilities, upgraded systems, faster systems. I myself just had fiber installed a few weeks ago into my home, but I had cable before, and that provided me with a good amount of decent amount of speed, so we could do this this video interview. But now there's a competitor, and now they're fighting for my business and everyone else's business, and that's a business decision. So I don't want to on the one hand pretend like the telecom companies are heroes here, but I also want to caution people against, turning them into villains either. I like to say that these companies don't have a soul, and a that's not an attack on them. It's not a value judgment. It's simply a fact. They are driven by their desire for profits, and you have to treat them as if that is their purpose. You can't shame them. They are not human. You can't anthropomorphize them. Um,
No, but you can regulate them. You can't say, okay,
you can absolutely,
you
and
make
that's
5 billion a year, and as a result, we're gonna make you do 2 billion worth of stuff.
yeah,
Whether that's
exactly,
journalism
and
or
that is my
equitable
argument. Is
access or whatever.
if there's something about Bell that you don't like them doing, your response isn't to write letters or start petitions. It's to talk to your MP about new laws or talk to the CRTC about new regulations. And they'll complain about it, just like they complained last week with CRTC, but they'll do it because they're a business and
Yeah.
that's what they do. Um, so yeah, as a lot of people have suggested that Bell in particular should, because their BCE makes money, that Bell should be spending some of that money subsidizing, sort of cross-subsidizing Bell Media and CTV in particular, which, CTV, despite everything, doesn't really make money. According to Bell's filings with the CRTC, CTV about breaks even. It's a bit of a loss for them. Um, and the and that might be a good argument, but if you're going to make that argument, then you have to deal with what about a company like TELUS, for example, that doesn't have a broadcasting outlet? Do they not have to subsidize television? Do they have to pay into some sort of fund? Do they have to buy television stations and start a TV network? Um, so, people have suggested taxing internet providers or television providers even more than they currently are. That is a potential solution. But if you want to argue that there should be some sort of cross subsidy, then you have to come up with a policy that works for all these situations and not just say, well, Bell has to do it.
I mean, that brings us sort of to another sort of flashpoint in the sort of journalism, which is the sort of idea of public funding. Obviously, the CBC has been a mainstay of Canadian and Quebec journalism for since its inception. But now we're seeing. I mean, so I guess again, I would sort of present to you sort of a big picture, maybe slightly provocative idea, which is simply that journalism as a public service is really expensive if you try to get individuals to pay for it. But if you try to get a government to pay for it, it's pretty cheap. It's like maybe if for $1 billion a year, you could basically, or a few $1 billion a year, you could basically hire all the journalists who currently exist and then some, and have them just do their work and not have to work, not have to worry about corporate structures and cuts and all this stuff. Which is like, yeah, I mean, that's basically nothing for a government. For one of the major institutions of a democratic society. And we do seem to be sort of, inching in that direction with the Registered Canadian Journalism Organization status. The Quebec is now significantly subsidizing journalism positions at nonprofits, I think, but also maybe even for profits. So you have a lot of like government subsidies coming in. I'm curious sort of how you see that landscape unfolding and what kind of effects you see it having on the overall situation.
So yeah, we do have a bit of that already, whether it's tax credits for the work of journalists, for payroll of journalists, some direct government subsidies. We see that with the new agreement with Google that provides $100 million to news outlets. It's true that it would not, like, it would be doable financially, whether it's through just the government spending the money or through taxing internet providers. There's a suggestion of taxing, devices. Anything with a screen would have a tax attached to it, kind of like the TV tax in Great Britain, or taxing digital services. The government wants to put in place a digital services tax. So there are good ideas as far as the revenue side of this. Where it runs into a bit of a problem is how do you disperse that money? Um, and that requires the government deciding, either directly or through a third party, what constitutes a journalist and what journalists, what money they're entitled to. And that becomes problematic. For the political reason, we already have Pierre Poilievre going around and saying that every journalist is on the take from the government because they get tax subsidies, um, which is a bit nutty. But there are a lot of people who believe that the journalists that the mainstream journalists are on the take for the government, and this doesn't really help that. But also, it's very easy to say, okay, CBC. Do you include CBC is another question because they're already paid for by the government. But include CTV or the Globe and Mail or La Presse, the Canadian press, sure. But do you include Rebel News? Do you include the Tyee? Do you include the Breach? Do you include Ricochet? Do you include CUTV? Do you include more activist media? Do you include research publications or policy analyst publications and stuff like that? One thing people don't realize is that the government, both in Canada and the United States, has not really defined what a journalist is. And that is sort of by design because we have, in our most sacred laws, the protection of freedom of expression, which means that anyone, you, me, guy on the street, can call themselves a journalist, can perform journalism, can request information from the government, can interview people, can present information to the public. They do not need a license to do that. They do not need special permission. And they do not get, on a legal basis at least, they do not get special powers from doing that. And so there is no, there are organizations that provide, sort of journalist ID cards and whatever, but there's nothing officially in the law.
Mm-hmm.
And so to give them money, you have to have a system. And that's what they try to do with this sort of qualified Canadian journalism organization status, to separate out real journalists from not real journalists or journalists who don't deserve money. And that is a big minefield as far as, the kind of journalists that you're subsidizing, what kind of journalism they're doing. Maybe, yeah, you give that money to, say, CTV or whatever, but how do you know that money is being spent on actual journalism and the kind of journalism that is worth subsidizing as opposed to just paying, whatever? And how do you know that money is, the government likes to call it incremental,
Yeah.
meaning that it is doing more journalism instead of paying the journalists that they were paying out of their own pocket previously, and they're taking that money and just pocketing it. So that is where it becomes very complicated. Something like tax credits simplifies it a bit because you're trying to be agnostic. You're saying it doesn't matter what you do. If you're spending this money on journalism, if the work that is being done is journalism, then you will get a tax credit. You will have to pay fewer taxes, or maybe you can get a refund. But we're not going to judge what the journalism is. But the more you get into this sort of direct government compensation, the more you have to not only evaluate the organization, but evaluate the journalism that they're doing. And then that creates a conflict of interest, whether people like to admit it or not, when your salary is dependent on government policy, and in particular, what government is in power. You might say that's not going to affect my journalism. I'm going to cover federal politics the same way, but that is still a conflict because it has a material financial impact.
I feel like the counterpoint is like, okay, you can acknowledge that that's going to be imperfect no matter what, and you're going to have edge cases that don't work. But the alternative is basically to allow, major advertisers and corporate entities that have the capital to sort of create journalism, to decide what journalism is, and to shape, the public sphere in their image, as opposed to, having a somewhat imperfect arm's length body definition, whatever, that decides what journalism is, and then maybe lets some, maybe excludes some things and includes things that we don't like, and so on. But overall, it seems like we have a multi-decade case study in this called the CBC, which is of course arm's length from the government, but still influenced by the government significantly, but has, I would say, consistently produced better journalism and elevated the overall field of journalism in Canada. Whereas the other case study is the U.S., where you see commercial interests dominating TV news, for example, and you have the kind of most debased, if it bleeds it leads, commercialization of the news, and a lack of sort of civic coverage that actually engages with the values of the people who their audiences is.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of differences between Canada and the U.S. as far as how journalism is funded and how local news is done. If your argument is that the CBC is a good example, that is an argument. I think a lot of people would argue that the CBC is, a sort of a warning of what can happen if we sort of generalize this. For example, the CBC gets, as we hear a lot, $1 billion a year from the government. How much of that is spent on journalism versus spent on entertainment television for CBC TV, or programming that it doesn't really have a sort of public interest mandate, and how much is spent on middle management or systems that are almost immune to innovation because they don't have to worry about where their revenue is coming from.
Well, again, I would simply say, like, the journalism that's produced by it is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. Maybe not even good by like a objective, like, absolute standpoint. From my perspective, I really deeply frustrated with a lot of the coverage. But if I feel like even somebody who really doesn't like the CBC and the way they cover things, like me, can like understand that, like, the overall journalism that happens when you have a publicly funded journalistic body, where it is free of those sort of commercial pressures, and the total fealty to advertisers and working within those sort of big corporate structures, can have tremendous benefits.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that we should, I'm not one of those defund the CBC people. Absolutely. I would argue that it might be better to have a more diverse ecosystem where you have the CBC, you have the public broadcaster, the public mandate, but you also have large, private news organizations. You have smaller private news organizations. You have nonprofits, even activist publications, even the True North and Press Progress of the world, that maybe have an agenda, but will uncover things or present things that other organizations won't be interested in or won't want to touch. I think having a more diverse, a more encompassing, a more just various different sources as opposed to one source or one funding model.
I mean, it sounds like you're making the case for the QCJO, the Qualified Canadian Journalism Organization model, which basically just says, okay, once you're in the door as a basic journalistic organization, you get funding, or you get, not funding, but you get tax credits to, like, encourage you to hire journalists.
Yeah, but again, it comes down to, who decides who qualifies and what are the criteria there, and
we actually have no idea when it comes to the QCJO. It's a very opaque.
They have like guidelines, but the problem is that those guidelines are interpreted by humans, and those humans may have preconceived notions of what kind of journalism they want to see funded, and that might not be the same kind of priorities that everyone else has. And it becomes a problem of sort of auditing that money too, especially when it comes to large organizations where you have, that might be getting a bunch of funding and saying they're using this funding for one thing, but when push comes to shove, especially later down the road when they have to make cuts, maybe they make cuts that, make that funding less useful, less worthy. Um, so I don't want to say that it's a bad idea. I don't want to say that I'm against it necessarily. But I would say that trying to find um, one solution in terms of government subsidy, one sort of funnel that you can put everything through, all the business models through, and that would fix all of them. I think um, that is problematic, and I would personally like to see a more diverse range of business models, some of which might be dependent on government subsidy, some of which might be dependent on other types of subsidy, and others might be entirely free of government subsidy. The more diversity you can have, the more different types of media you can have, the more different types of journalists you can have,
Mm-hmm.
and not just full-time journalists, not just the kind of people who walk into a desk and get a story from an assignment editor. Like, there are all sorts of different types of journalism that can be done out there, and all different ways of funding it. And I think the more diverse we can get about that, the better we are as a society as a whole.
That certainly sounds sensible. I've been pushing you obviously on this tax the telcos agenda and the public funding of media, but just to back up a bit from the sort of the specifics of this conversation, yeah, I'm curious as we wrap up to hear your sort of perspective on what going forward in Montreal, let's say Anglo Montreal specifically. What do you see as the sort of key um, challenges or questions that are on the horizon for the world of journalism, and specifically with regard to the public interest?
It's a very broad question. I will say that we focus a lot on the news organizations and what are they going to do. Um, but I think we also need to think about the consumers. What do Joe and Jane Doe do? How do they consume media and content this day and age? When you're getting all of your news from Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, um, that incentivizes the news organizations to use those platforms to reach you, and then it creates a dependence, and it creates um, a problem when you're relying on either social media in general or social media algorithms in particular. So I think everyone involved, whether it's news organizations, individual consumers, social media companies, traditional media companies, they all have to have a thought about how we get information from journalists to consumers, and how can we make that process better for everyone involved. Um, if we don't, if we do this kind of half-assed, like, the journalism is there. I think that one of the biggest problems with people understanding the world around them is that the information is there. This, Wikipedia is free, easily accessible, easily searchable. News articles are there. How many times have you gone on an online discussion and someone says, like, Google is free, you can just look it up yourself, and people are not incentivized to do that. And so I think we need to find ways to um, connect people better with the information that they're seeking, or the information that they should be seeking, to get a more balanced, a more complete view of the world around them. And I don't have any, magical solutions to this. I do think that journalists need to be a bit more concerned about educating people than, just providing that news of the day, that here's what's happened in this 24-hour cycle. Um, but um, but yeah, I think it's not just a Montreal thing, obviously, but just generally speaking, for me, news and journalism is all about education. It's not a you're trying to explain something to people who should have this information to be, to improve their personal lives, to be better public citizens, to better push their politicians to do, the things that make our world better. Um, and so for me, the question is always, how do we better educate the public about what's going on in the world? And I think we need to, everyone involved in this process needs to have that at the forefront of their mind, be like, how do I improve this system so that people are better informed about what's going on, people are better educated about the world?
That's a great question to ask going forward. Thanks so much, Steve Faguy, for taking the time. Where can people find you online?
So I am unfortunately still on Twitter at Fagstein, Fagstein. My blog is fagstein.com. You can see my work, although not my name, every day in the Montreal Gazette, where I'm a copy editor. And yeah, random interviews like this, I guess. But yeah, that's where you'll find most of what I do.
Thanks again.
You're very welcome. Have a good day.